All right, First Chronicles chapter 5, let's call this one Reconciliation and subtitle it Personality, because in this chapter we are going to get the chance to see how those east of the Jordan River, meaning Moses was able to conquer a certain portion of territory east of the Jordan River, leaving Joshua to lead the nation in conquering the rest of the territory west of the Jordan River. This genealogy in chapter 5 is going to talk about the 2.5 tribes that settled the land that was conquered east of the Jordan River, meaning Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. And one term is going to come up at least twice in this chapter, and that is the whole concept of valiant men, noting that these tribes ended up developing a band of valiant men. And it's going to say that God delivered those valiant men during the time of desperation. When they were in war, no matter how valiant they were, they looked at their adversary and they were like, we need help. And so they called out sincerely to God, and because they trusted God, it's going to say that God answered them because they were also fighting a battle that God sent them out to fight. And that's always important because it can be so tempting to pick our battles and then choose to invoke God into fights that we feel are important. Much like we saw Joshua before they got into the heat of the battles in conquering the promised land. He came into contact with the captain of the Lord's army, and before he knew who he was, he asked, "Are you for us or for them?" And the captain of the Lord's army said, "No." Basically reminding Joshua that as the captain of the Lord's army, he was not picking sides. He was simply there to do what was right, whether or not Israel was choosing to do that or not, because in a few chapters, we were going to see that the sword of the Lord was going to turn against Israel just as quickly as it did against the Canaanites when Israel chose to do wrong. And so that's something that can be easy to forget when we give into the temptation to run ahead of God and pick battles that he might not have chosen. And that's going to be important to remember because in the latter portion of the chapter, it is going to talk about how the valiant men on the east side of the Jordan River ended up falling and being carted off into captivity, because after they settled down and things got a little bit easier, they fell into another temptation that I think threatens us all. And that's the temptation of comfort, the one we saw David fall into after the struggles of his early life were over. When he, during the time when kings usually went out to war, he was resting at home and he saw Bathsheba and made a decision that was going to trouble him for many, many years to come. Likewise, when things get easy, that is a time we often mention we need to be careful, because that is something that is going to get the valiant men of Gilead, which is a term used to describe that land east of the Jordan River. It's something that's going to get them caught up as well. Why? Because, as we mentioned, most of the 12 spies were not afraid to go into the promised land because the people were underwhelming. It's because they seemed overwhelming. It was a prosperous land filled with healthy-looking people. And so when God warned them to be careful of partnering with the people of the land, he was potentially warning them of something in modern terms that experts will call placing too much emphasis on a person or a group's personality as opposed to their character, because he was letting them know that no matter what you might have seen in their outward appearance, what they projected, inwardly they carried some shady habits that the children of Israel needed to stay far away from. And the pattern that we seem to see emerging in Israel is this. Much like Samson during the time of the judges, spent so much time around Delilah that he was no longer able to outsmart her schemes after a certain point. He was irreparably damaged by partnering with her based upon the fact that no matter what he liked in Delilah outwardly, there were some parts of her character inwardly that made her very dangerous to keep spending time around. And likewise with the valiant men of Gilead east of the Jordan River, we're getting a chance to see that no matter what they found outwardly appealing about the Canaanites, they ended up picking up habits from them that over time even led the most valiant men of Gilead into irreparable damage. And so this chapter gives us an example of why looking beyond outward appearances or personality can be so helpful in avoiding irreparable damage. But it also gives us an example of how hard it can be to recover in circumstances where the damage isn't irreparable, because when we get to the time of Zerubbabel, one of the things that God is going to have to do through the prophets is continually encourage the people about how even though it's going to seem difficult, maybe almost impossible to rebuild Jerusalem after they are allowed to go back, it's still possible. Rebuilding is simply way more difficult than they ever imagined when they were enamored with what they saw in the Canaanites, without paying attention to the warnings that God was giving Israel about the Canaanites' character.